Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome here this evening to this lecture, this inaugural lecture by Professor Richard Layte. So, on behalf of the Dean, Darrell Jones, I'm representing the faculty. My name is Owen O'Sullivan. I'm the head of the School of Social Work and Social Policy that works very closely with the School of Social Science and Philosophy, where Richard is based. So to welcome you all, distinguished guests, including our Provost, Patrick Prendergast, sitting amongst us here. The format this evening is that we will have Richard's inaugural lecture followed by 3 sets of comments from his 3 associate schools or departments of economics, politics and philosophy. So Professor John O'Hagan, Professor Anne Wren and Professor Paul O'Grady will respond to the presentation by Richard, given approximately about 10 minutes each. We aim to conclude by about 10 to 7, and you're all very welcome to reception in the Senior Common Room at 7 o'clock. Richard is Professor of Sociology here in Trinity and a research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute. After receiving his doctorate from the University of Oxford in 1996, Richard worked in Nuffield College, Oxford, on a comparative study of the effects of unemployment precarity, unemployment and social exclusion before moving to the ESRI in 1998. He became research professor at the ESRI in 2006 and joined the Department of Sociology in the School of Social Science and Philosophy last September 2004. Much of his work stems from a core interest in the structure of social and economic stratification in modern societies and its impact on individual life chances, health and well-being. His research examines the fundamental processes which influence the distribution of health and well-being in societies and how these are shaped by political economy and the structure and functioning of healthcare systems. Much of his early work examined the measurement analysis of poverty, deprivation and social exclusion, and how this relates to core economic and sociological processes. His work on disadvantage has also led to a number of publications on social class and social mobility in Ireland and how this has changed with Irish social and economic development. His recent work has examined the relationship between country income inequality and individual health, and he has a particular interest in improving understanding of how family background influences the child's health and the development and the impact this has on the child's educational outcomes. He has a keen interest in Irish healthcare and the role that healthcare can play in improving health and well-being. His lecture tonight is Can We Balance Social Equality with Economic Growth? Lessons from the Life Course Model of Human Development. So I'd like you to welcome Professor Richard Layte for his inaugural lecture.
Good evening, and thank you very much for coming along this evening. Provost, colleagues, guests, many friendly faces in the audience, thank you very much for coming along. I'm delighted and honoured to be giving my inaugural lecture as Professor of Sociology this evening. My first 6 months at Trinity College have been a real pleasure. I've been struck by the warm and generous reception that I've received from colleagues and students alike. It's been a real pleasure. So this evening, what I want to do is I want to draw upon a number of different threads of my academic research, carried out over the last 2 decades, and I hate to say that, it has been 2 decades, to present an argument around a question that my work repeatedly returns to. And that is this: how does a child's social background shape their educational and occupational trajectory, and what implications does this association have for the society at large? Now, my answer to this question spotlights 3 elements of my own work, which I believe should have a much wider importance within academia and within social science. First, the value of interdisciplinary research, not only within the social sciences, but also between the social and natural sciences. Second, the importance of a longitudinal approach to data and explanation. Thirdly, the crucial role of policy choices by governments in shaping the distribution of outcomes across individuals and the influence that this has on the development of societies overall. So there are 2 real parts to this lecture. In the first part, I want to show you that the stubbornness of some of the social problems that have developed since the 1970s stem in part from the policies which successive governments in Europe have adopted in response to the period of low growth, economic restructuring and high unemployment, which brought the 30 glorious years of post-war growth shuddering to a close in the mid-1970s. In the second part, I want to show why these policy choices are counterproductive by convincing you that child development is actually shaped by a complex interaction between the child and its physical and psychosocial environment, and that this environment is shaped by a family's income and social position. So in short, I think you could sum it all up, if you wanted to leave now, by poor social and economic position begets poor social and economic position. And this makes the reproduction of inequalities very stark. We're going to start with the liberal theory of industrialization. Now, this emerged from the work of a number of social scientists, mainly from North America, working in different disciplines from the 1950s through to the 1980s, although there were still actually some examples of it in the early 1990s. So look, here's some book covers and some paper titles. So we have people here like Clark Kerr from 1960, Simon Kuznets, the paper there on economic growth and income inequality, papers by Torquil Parsons, Peter Blau and Otis Dudley Duncan, particularly famous amongst sociologists, many of you in the audience will recognise that one, and Don Tryman as well. And we could even add, and you see him there on the right, Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man from 1992. It was sort of a late addition to the liberal theory literature. So although working on different issues in economics, sociology and political science, these social scientists arrived at a position which was essentially similar and which has been labelled the liberal theory of industrialisation. Now, what is it? Well, developed during the period of growth which followed the end of the Second World War through to the mid-1970s, and largely in reaction to the evolutionary scenario set out by Karl Marx. These theorists put forward a more optimistic logic of capitalist development and industrialisation, within which societies would become increasingly structured according to rationalistic principles, as scientific knowledge shaped not only the development of new wealth-creating technologies, but the improvement of society itself. This process would not only increase overall wealth in a society, but also push those societies toward an ideal where social equality was balanced with individual rights. The result would be an inexorable dynamic toward liberal democracy and increasing living standards, driven by technological advancement, which would lead to decreasing income inequality and increasing meritocracy, as ability and effort were rewarded whilst ascription and nepotism slowly dwindled. So here's my schematic, trying to show you some of the main dimensions of it, and I've brought this down to 4 principles. The first one, up here on the top left, is that the Industrial Revolution was actually quite a sort of rule of thumb, low-tech affair, whereas post-industrial society is going to emerge from high technology, based on sound theoretical knowledge, abstract knowledge. Now, this is going to require, on the top right here, theoretical understanding, and that requires higher education. That's going to mean a growth of higher education institutions, because there's going to be an increasing need for people with that kind of theoretical knowledge. The third aspect there on the bottom left is this increased rationalism, professionalism, leading to better governance in societies overall and the improved use of human potential. And as that human potential is used better, we see finally growing meritocracy. Ability is going to be recognised and developed so that the link between the family of origin and their education, the child's education, that's going to wane, as will the link between the origin, the child's origin and their final occupational destination. Now, the reality was actually rather different. Now, the predictions of the liberal theory about the growing wealth of post-industrial nations has been borne out since the 1970s. So you can see here, for instance, the large-scale growth in per capita income over time between 1970 and 2012. Now, this is rather exaggerates the growth for Ireland because it doesn't net out the profits of those multinationals that Ireland has that should be taken out of the picture. But essentially, you can see Ireland and other countries growing very strongly during this period. This is real growth. This is real income and wealth that these countries, they're much richer now than they were in 1970. Also, of course, this huge drop happening after 2008, Ireland's drop being larger than all the rest. So, in one very real sense, the post-industrial society and the theory of industrialisation were right. We have seen large increases in wealth. But its predictions in terms of the spread of these benefits across social groups has been pretty far off the mark. Income inequality has increased steadily across the majority of OECD states. Patterns of social mobility and equality of opportunity have been stagnant, or even there's some indication that they're worsening. Levels of income poverty have increased, particularly for children and young people, and the employment growth that has occurred has tended to be concentrated in work-rich rather than work-poor households, leading to an increasing dichotomisation there. So what happened? Why have these patterns of inequality from the past been so stubborn in the face of such large increases in societal wealth, and perhaps even gotten worse? Well, the liberal theorists were correct in believing that knowledge and skills would become more important over time. The wealth creation of recent decades is in no small part to the increases in productivity brought about by information technology. The move away from extractive and primary industries and the growth of financial service and high technology sectors across the OECD has meant that the proportion of professional, technical and managerial positions in the labour force has increased, as has the non-manual component of the labour force. All seem to be unexpected by the liberal theory. But the increase in the demand for skilled workers and weakened trade union power has led to an increasing gap opening up between the wages of skilled and unskilled workers. At the same time, high levels of unemployment and underemployment, particularly among lower skilled workers, has become almost endemic as companies and organisations have sought to maintain and maximise profitability through flexible labour practices. Governments across the OECD have facilitated this through the diminution of labour market regulation, the legalisation of more flexible labour contracts, and the weakening of collective bargaining, that is, trade unions. Now, understandably, successive governments have found it difficult to maintain welfare spending in the face of shrinking tax rates, higher levels of unemployment, and an ageing population, which is leading to higher costs in society. And they've been faced with what my colleague, Anne Wren, who will be speaking in a little while, has termed the trilemma of the social service economy. And this is a quote from Anne up here. Governments and nations confront a three-way choice, or trilemma, between budgetary restraint, income inequality and employment growth. While it's possible to pursue two of these goals simultaneously, it's so far proved impossible to achieve all three. Private employment growth can only be accomplished at the cost of wage inequality. Therefore, if wage inequality is a priority, employment growth can be generated only through the employment in the public sector, at the cost of higher taxes and borrowing. Now, the answer that many countries have arrived at, both in Europe and in the wider OECD, is to lower the level of social protection that those outside of the labour market receive by reducing the level and coverage of social assistance and tightening the conditions under which those benefits are paid. You can see that here. The change in net social assistance benefit packages from the early 2000s up to 2009. And as you can see, the social assistance benefit package in many countries has fallen as a proportion of the median income in the majority of European states. The median income being that value of income, halfway up the income distribution if everyone's ranked by income. Kind of the average. Now, this reduction in benefit levels was in part a redistribution of resources to other forms of welfare state expenditure. This is part of the argument I want to make this evening. Rather than funding traditional redistributive social welfare transfers, many states have concentrated on increasing labour market activation. That is, increasing the proportion of people who are working, even if the jobs they take up are relatively low paid. A constant refrain here is making work pay, so that the balance of incentives is towards paid work in the labour market rather than the opposite. Policies in this ilk include spending on childcare so that women will be able to combine family life with work and active labour market policies, which increase the skills and capabilities of unemployed people. A common description of this policy strategy is that of the social investment state, made famous by the chapter of the same name in Anthony Giddens' book from 1998 on the third way. Do you remember the third way? Giddens' ideas provided the conceptual underpinning for the policies of New Labour in the UK during his tenure as director of the London School of Economics. The fundamental idea here is that the social investment strategy is that the social welfare expenditure should try to increase the human capital of the vulnerable so they can play a role in the labour market and become self-sufficient. And the central ideas are that work is good for the individual because it gives them purpose. And it's good for their children because it teaches them the habit of working. And it's good for society because, of course, workers pay taxes. In Giddens' view, social investment strategies would come to replace traditional redistributive welfare strategies. But there are several big questions around this. Can a social investment strategy make up for the disadvantages already visited on those social groups who are vulnerable to unemployment and poverty? Can low-paid work and active labour market policies in adulthood really compensate for the accumulated disadvantages experienced in life prior to these activities? Jost Esping Andersen, the Danish welfare state researcher made famous by his book on the three worlds of welfare capitalism, has argued that it can't. So here's a quote from Josta. The third way may be criticised for its unduly selective appropriation of Nordic social democratic policy. First, it has a tendency to believe that activation may substitute for conventional income maintenance guarantees. This may be regarded as naive optimism, but worse, it may also be counterproductive. The minimisation of poverty and income security is a precondition for an effective social investment strategy. Second, a truly effective and sustainable social investment strategy must be biased towards preventative policy. Now, these are numbers that I've taken out of an OECD report from 2008 entitled Growing Unequal. And as you can see, this reduction in social assistance levels that we previously looked at has meant there's been a general rise in the risk of relative income poverty across a number of states since the 1980s. Now, not all. You can see there Belgium, Denmark, Mexico actually, large falls. And also that the distribution of the risk of poverty has changed from older age groups onto those of working age people and children. This has been a direct policy priority. You can see here, each of the lines represents a decade, essentially, and along the horizontal axis at the bottom, you can see age from the youngest on the left to the oldest on the right. And you can see that over the decades, the risk for the older age groups has gone down, whereas the risk for the working age groups has gone up. Now, this doesn't mean that the risks of poverty across countries has converged. On the contrary, country policies mean that the rates of poverty in the worst performing countries are 5 times higher than the rates in the best performing countries. And we also see much higher rates of poverty amongst children in most countries relative to the general population. So children are the yellow bars and the general population are in red. And you can see in most countries, actually, children are at a higher risk of income poverty than adults. But interestingly, if you look on the far left, there's a group of countries where children have a lower risk of income poverty. And it's no accident that those countries tend to be quite Scandinavian. Okay, we're on to the second part of the lecture. And here, what I want to talk about is I want to try to show you why the change in policy stance adopted in many countries in recent decades cannot be successful in creating the skilled, flexible, innovative workforce that most countries actually desire. And I'm hoping to do this by drawing upon a number of different strands of my work to show you how childhood environment shapes the development of the child and their capacity to become healthy, happy, well-adjusted and independent. Members of society, simply, who can contribute to economic growth. Now, first, I should say a few words about the huge amount of research that has been carried out on the reproduction of social advantage in sociology and economics. The social sciences have actually been very effective in offering both theories and data about the reproduction of social and economic inequality between generations. There's a large literature of social mobility research which has investigated the association between the social class, education and income of the family of origin, usually the father, and the attainment of the child. Now, this literature has shown, pretty conclusively, should be said, that children from working class origins do less well in the education system and are less likely to complete upper secondary education, that is, the leaving certificate level qualifications, and to make the transition into third level education. Worse educational performance is one of the reasons why these working class children are also more likely to end up in working class jobs and are less likely to reach the more rewarding, higher level occupations in the professions and in the upper levels of management and business. Here's some research from ESRI researchers, Selina McCoy and Delma Byrne, which shows that the chance that young people are going to retain at least 2 honours in the leaving certificate is strongly structured by social class of their family. You can see here, look, very tall bars amongst those higher and lower professionals and amongst those employers and managers, and the bars getting gradually smaller. So the odds ratio, the chance of them getting those 2 leaving certs, which are in a sense an indicator of their ability to get into college, their attainment in school, is lower amongst these working class groups. Similarly, here's a slide that shows how the chance of making the transition from school into higher education is also structured by social background. So on the left, there's higher education. That's your probability of getting into higher education. You can see around about a 25% difference, 20% difference between those white-collar salariat groups, these are the professionals basically, and the working class groups. So again, access to higher education is strongly structured by the social background of the child. Now, my own research with my colleague Chris Whelan, who's now based at UCD, has shown that the pattern of association between a child's class origins and their social class destination changed relatively little from the 1970s to the 2000s in Ireland, and the same is true for a large number of other countries of Western Europe and North America. Now, once again, this isn't to say that these countries don't vary in terms of the openness of their patterns of social mobility. Comparative work that we did with colleagues from other countries has shown that Ireland is one of the less open social mobility regimes alongside France and Germany, whilst Britain, and particularly Sweden, Hungary, and the Netherlands, had more open social mobility regimes. You can see this here. So Ireland, third in from the left, the higher the line, the stronger the association between family of origin, that's your mum and dad, and the child's occupational attainment. And you can see that that association is strongest really in France and Germany and in Ireland, Ireland falling between the 70s and the 90s, though not significantly, it should be said. Whereas it's much lower, that association, in Sweden, Poland, Hungary and the Netherlands, with strong falls you can see for Hungary and the Netherlands in the later periods. Now, why is there this association between family background and educational attainment? This is a really big question. Now, the Education Research Unit at the ESRI, and I'm very pleased to see some representatives here from that this afternoon, has carried out a large amount of research on the social patterns of educational attainment in Ireland and the factors that explain this. Using very high quality data and longitudinal research, this shows that some of this association can be explained by the educational values of working class children, mixed with an increasing estrangement of working class pupils from the educational process, leading to worsening pupil-teacher relationships as the years go on in school. The research also shows that working class children and their parents often have less information available to them when making choices about the transition to higher education, with the result that they often choose not to go on. They see the costs as too high and the benefits as too little. This Irish research confirms many of the patterns found in other countries about the factors that explain the association between the child's family of origin and their educational attainment. Now, whilst I think that this research is very important, and I think it's extremely good research, well carried out, excellent methodologically, she does protest too much. I felt for a long time that these explanations from economics and sociology for the poor performance of working class children in school don't really fully explain the reasons why these children should behave worse in the classroom and display less educational ability than their peers from higher income and higher social class households. Now, class culture may explain some of the differential, and I think it explains a good bit of the differential, but I don't think it explains all. And it occurs to me that we need, and it did occur to me, that we need to examine the early life experiences of children and analyse how these influence the educational development of the child, as well as the classroom interactions and decision-making of pupils, teachers and parents. The cultural and rationalistic explanations offered by sociology and economics don't really pay enough attention to the physical and psychological development of the child and the way in which this is shaped by the social and economic resources of the parents and the household from a very young age. We have, to a certain extent, pursued a rather disembodied conception of how social reproduction comes about, rather than trying to show how the social and economic inequalities experienced by the child literally shape their physical and psychological development. Now, this has been the subject of a programme of research by myself and a number of colleagues, both at the ESRI and TCD, over recent years. We have sought understanding of the way in which social disadvantage becomes embodied in individuals, and we found that this requires a close collaboration between social and natural scientists, since both provide key insights into the complex pathways through which social risk exposures shape individual health and development. And I'm very pleased, actually, to be able to say that we've recently been awarded some funding by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 programme to examine these processes across a number of European countries and the US over the next 7 years, which was good news. Now, the salience of both the previous research and the future research has been underlined over the last 5 or 6 years with the fiscal crisis in Ireland. The rise in unemployment and the fall in income experienced by many families in Ireland has had a dramatic impact on the living standards of families. The proportion of families experiencing lifestyle deprivation has more than doubled since 2007. These are real impacts on the day-to-day lives of families with children, or families more generally. And I'm doing work with Liz Nixon from the Department of Psychology looking at this in terms of its impact on children's outcomes and the processes through which it impacts on them. So how does early life environment shape child development and attainment? Well, the child's developmental trajectory is shaped by the complex interaction of child physiology with physical and psychosocial environment. Together, these dictate the child's ability to learn, to establish relationships, and to self-regulate their emotions. All very important skills in life, I think you'll agree. But how does low income and financial strain actually impact on this process? I'm an academic and we like theories, so I've got 2 theories for you. One, the family investment model, and the second, the family stress model. So what is the family investment model? This says that lower family income shapes child development by limiting the material resources available to the family to spend on the essentials of food, housing, warmth, and all of the things that contribute to physical development and mental well-being. Low income means less age-appropriate toys, books and experiences, and lower parental education, which often means less cognitive and linguistic stimulation to the child. All these things contribute to academic and social competence and better educational performance for the child. The family stress model, on the other hand, holds that low income shapes the child development indirectly through economic strain. Stressed parents have less patience and tolerance and are more likely to use harsher punishments, show less warmth, and be more inconsistent with their children. These parenting behaviours are in turn lead to imitation and reactive behaviours among children and a less positive adjustment overall. So here's my schematic to show you how those 2 theories link together. So on the one hand, on the sort of higher pathway, you've got household income shaping parental investments in the child in a very generalised fashion, leading to child cognitive development and physical development, and then their educational development. On the lower line, you have household income shaping parental distress, their own psychological distress, which then shapes their mental health and then has its impact on child psychological adjustment. So, those 2 theories give us guidance as to how income shapes the child. And it starts from a very young age. These are birth weights by a social class group from growing up in Ireland, from some of the work that I've been doing. What this shows you is that even in the womb and prior to birth, children from different socioeconomic groups are exposed to less of the factors that lead to growth, which means that they're smaller by the time they're born. You can see here about 1/5 of a kilo lighter for those who are in this unclassified group. That's households who we couldn't allocate a class to because they had no previous experience of employment that we could use. But you see that it's a graduated relationship across the class distribution. Now, birth weight is a strong predictor of child health. There's a lot of processes that not only lead to low birth weight, but then low birth weight contributes to in terms of both chronic illness for the child, but also their acute probability of acute infections. And what you see here is exactly that, the probability of acute infections by household income. And you can see it's highest for those in the low income groups and then falling down as we go up the income distribution. Now, low birth weight and more acute infections and chronic illness means slower growth during childhood as the body seeks to defend itself rather than laying down tissue, laying down growth patterns. And that means that we see a pattern of shorter children amongst those in lower income households. And this is true both in Ireland, so they're the GUI lines, where it says GUI infants and children, but also in Great Britain. This is data from the Millennium Cohort. And you can see in all of them, we see these relationships between income and the child's physical height as measured. These are measurements from the children in their own households. So those deficits that they experienced very early on continue through their lives, which means they are short compared to their more advantaged peers. That advantage in terms of material circumstances goes on through their life. So here's some research from Selina McCoy, a nice paper in Child Indicators back in 2012, which shows the advantage in terms of participation in organised cultural activities, like dance and ballet here. You can see the boys do a little bit less dance and ballet than the girls, quite a bit less. But there's advantages in other things for the boys too. So essentially, those investments that I was talking about go on through the child's life. And what Selina's research showed is that this contributes to the child's educational development. So the more of these investments that the child gets, the better their educational performance, adjusting for a whole lot of other processes. Okay? So you can see that investments model has some traction. It does seem to explain quite a lot. But these processes are not just to do with the physical development of the child. And also the mental components are not ignored. If we look here at the effect of low income on maternal depression, you can see the way that low income has its consequences in terms of the mental health of individuals. So as we move from the lowest income groups to the highest income groups, the probability of the mother having depression, as measured by one of our validated scales, decreases strongly. So the risk or the probability of depression is 3 times higher amongst women in the lowest 20% of the income distribution compared to the highest 20% of the income distribution. And that has real consequences because in pregnancy what we find is that the mothers coming from lower education, lower income, lower social class groups are much more likely to smoke. And they're much more likely to smoke, it seems in part, because of the depression and the mental health issues that they're facing. So it's not a lifestyle choice that these women are adopting. It's not that they think that smoking is okay. If you talk to women about smoking in pregnancy, they all realise that it's not good for their unborn child. But it's part of a constellation of factors that they're trying to cope with during the pregnancy and in their lives that leads to higher rates of smoking. So we see here about a 33% increase in the adjusted risk of smoking. So we're adjusting for a lot of other things if the mother's experiencing depression. Now, let's go back to my theories I was painting for you earlier on about the family stress model. Do you remember what that was saying? It was saying that psychological distress as a function of economic strain leads to decreasing quality of relationship amongst the parents and decreasing maternal warmth as maternal distress, her depression, as psychological distress goes up. Now, this graph shows that nicely. You can see here, as the number of years poor, which is the horizontal axis at the bottom there, as the number of years poor goes up, maternal distress, as measured by the Kessler index, is increasing. At the same time, we see this falling quality of relationship amongst the amongst the parents and falling maternal warmth. We found that these things were very predictive of the child's cognitive development and their psychological adjustment. Two very important variables when we're explaining educational outcomes. We found, in fact, that when we did the math, we did the modelling, that those two variables, cognitive development and psychological adjustment, accounted for 75% of the income effect, not just low income, but the effect of the distribution of income on the child's educational attainment. You can see here that there's really strong evidence for the fact that that low income, via the mechanisms that I mapped out for you, impacts very strongly on the child's outcomes. And it gives us grave concern that those children are going to be at a strong disadvantage, not only early in life, but later in life too, because education is going to be very important for their occupational attainment and then for their health and well-being in later life. So I just want to show you then the way that those processes impact on the child's educational and in a sense, their development. So here, this is 3. And you can see here that across 3 different validated measures of child ability, pattern construction, name of vocabulary, picture similarities, even at 3 years of age, we're already seeing these very large differences between income groups. By the time we get to 7, you can see that they're well established with, again, reading scales being well differentiated. I could show you the same patterns for maths. And here we see them at 7, but this time with differentiations by whether the child has good psychological adjustment or poor psychological adjustment, a factor that I've told you already is very important. And you can see that those children who've got poor psychological adjustment, they're not only more likely amongst those lower income groups, but it has a direct bearing on the educational development of the child. And we see that at 9 in our Growing Up in Ireland sample too. These are really well-established patterns. We can analyse these and we can see the effects. These are really well documented at this stage. So what's our policy response? How do we react to this? Well, taking a quote from Justa Anderson again, if the race is already halfway run, even before children begin school, then we clearly need to examine what happens in the earliest years. And here's another one from Jim Hetman, who some of you may come across. Like it or not, the most important mental and behavioural patterns once established are difficult to change once children enter school. It gets increasingly difficult and more expensive to fix these things the older the child gets. This is a particular favourite of mine, and you've probably all seen this before if you've seen me present. This is from Graham Allen and Ian Duncan Smith, actually 2 politicians from different ends of the political spectrum within the UK. If people keep falling off a cliff, don't worry about where you put the ambulance at the bottom, build a fence at the top and stop them falling off in the first place. That makes very good sense, doesn't it? Particularly when these outcomes that I've shown you are going to be so expensive in later life, and they're going to lead to such a loss of ability and growth potential. Why would we not intervene earlier? But of course, that means quite a change in policy stance. It means beginning to think very strongly about investing in children from an early age. It means taking those first 3 years really seriously. It means making sure that we have a pattern of investment in children which is front-loaded, rather than waiting until they get into college. We need to have upstream interventions, because they're going to be much more effective than downstream amelioration. It's much harder to mop up after the mess has been created in the first place. And this means really trying to maintain the living standards of families with young children, because as you've seen, those living standards have real consequences. Income security and parental well-being really are very crucial in this process. We need to think about minimising poverty and income poverty and maximising income security as a precondition for an effective social investment strategy. Now, we can do that via welfare policy, but we can also think about delivering universal services to families, because these have been shown to be very important. The provision of services can actually make a very economic form of intervention that has really excellent long-term consequences. So, for instance, public health nurses in the community have been shown to lead to improvements in child outcomes 18 years later. The return on that investment is something like $17 for every dollar that's invested. That's an amazing investment. Any banker would bite your hand off if you offered that investment in the money markets. Targeted interventions with disadvantaged groups are likely to be more effective and cost effective, but we shouldn't forget, in a sense, the universal services. And preschool education is particularly important in trying to iron out some of these inequalities that emerge from early years. So, here's a quote, although it's a quote from me. Ireland's future prosperity depends on having an educated, creative and competitive workforce. By investing in early childhood, we'll be developing healthier, happier and more productive adults for all our tomorrows, and saving money in the process. That sounds like a good idea to me. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Richard. We now have 3 respondents to the inaugural lecture by Richard. Our first is John O'Hagan from the Department of Economics in the School of Social Science Philosophy. John is Professor of Economics since 2005 and commenced his lecturing here in Trinity in 1970 and best known for his regularly updated book, The Economy of Ireland. So I'd like to invite John to respond.
So I want to congratulate Richard on a very fine lecture. My comments will be maybe a little more flippant. I thought people would get more tired as the evening goes on. But I want to say how much we very much welcome him to the school and for arranging this lecture in particular. I thought it was a novel idea to get all of the other departments in the school to respond and say what we do in relation to this very broad topic. I'm not sure why I was chosen. I've done some work on access to the high arts by education level, quite a bit of work, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is some reflections, what economists say or don't say about inequality. I suppose the first point I want to make is that all economists are not cold, hard-headed people. Economists do write about, it's not just the sociologists that care about the world, we care as well. And there's a lot of work done in economics on inequality and social exclusion, contrary to what most people, a lot of people think of economics and just think of banking and finance, and it's a much wider discipline than that. So I want to start with somebody I had contact with, many years ago, Amartya Sen, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he did some outstanding work on poverty and famine in India, and also this seminal book, Inequality Re-Examined. So, and there, as I've said here, or I should have said here, there have been, so I'm repeating what I've said, economists do research and care about inequality issues, and there's been a long line. I suppose the most important contribution would start up with Sen. So I'll come back to the more recent contribution at the very end. I just, as I said, some reflections, this sort of material I cover in class, so I'm not used. What causes inequality? And I'll just refer slightly to Richard's paper in that, but that informs policy then, and that was very evident from Richard's paper. So one is age. So I keep telling students, you know, you're going to be in the top, you're in the bottom 10% of income earners now, but in later life you're going to be in the top 10 or the top 5%. So that will just be maybe simply just a life cycle effect. The other is, if some people work much harder, much longer hours, so I often tell students they may be working in banking later on earning €200,000 a week, or a year, sorry. But, you know, they work horrendously long hours. And lastly is past savings, if somebody has just caroused and wasted money. So, so when people are reacting to doing anything about inequality, they're thinking of these causes. And what I would argue is maybe these are acceptable bases for inequality. But there are other causes of inequality. And Richard's paper was about that. Different abilities, different education, or most important of all, what I stress in lectures, is home background. Now, Richard said they talked about early intervention with young children, but how do you actually intervene in the homes? without overt intrusion. So it's home background, in my opinion, is by far the biggest determinant. And students, I keep reminding students that their home background is probably the biggest determinant of why they're in Trinity and how well they'll do in life. So that has a different effect. And then lastly, there's chance factors. I often wonder when, I remember somebody, a very wealthy person, won the lottery. Nobody complained. So I often wonder why these chance effects, which can, maybe it just affects a very small number of people, but some people have become fabulously wealthy because of chance events. And as I said, the lottery is probably the best single example. Just one last issue that we stress is the difference between horizontal and vertical equity. Horizontal equity is that people in same circumstances, so gender equality is to do with horizontal equity. But vertical equity is across income groups. So the discussion that Richard has and what I'm going to talk about is vertical equity. Very few people question that there should be horizontal equity, people in like circumstances treated the same. Why care about inequality? I like this image. I don't know why, because we all know about roles and so on, but this kind of captures it. You know, it's trying to say, well, can you imagine yourself? So you pass a beggar in the street and you say, well, would you be happy to swap places with that person? In other words, swap shoes. And the caption is at the bottom here. You probably can't see it. To put yourself in another's shoes, you've got to first unlace your own. So that's kind of a psychological, emotional argument, and I think it's very much linked to roles. But I just came across that for lectures and use it. It's a very nice one. The two other more economics-oriented reasons, though, are that it would increase the overall output of the economy by if you have untapped talent through the factors that Richard mentioned, then you're not exploiting the full potential of the economy. And the other thing that's often emphasised is if you do not address inequality, the cost will come back at you, even if you're the wealthy. It'll lead to external costs through crime and social unrest. So that's always a concern. As I say to students, what's the point in having a BMW in your driveway at home if you can't be sure it'll be there when you get home in the evening? So that's a pure self-interest, that it's in the interest of the wealthy and the non-wealthy to address severe inequality. I just want to talk about a number of issues that economists draw attention to. There's always this issue of disincentive effects of taxation. So you have to, if you're going to have target early childhood issues, that means money, and money must come from taxation. So economists are always worried about that, lack of work or people exiting the country. Another concern is, of course, welfare dependency and possible unemployment traps, but that doesn't relate to what Richard is talking about. And again, these unemployment traps are grossly over-exaggerated by the media, but there is this issue that economists draw attention to. Another issue is that we can only measure material well-being, and all of our statistics relate to material well-being. So you often hear people saying, well, it's what matters is happiness or general well-being, and we can't measure that. We must bear that in mind, that just because we don't have that measure doesn't mean we should not look at this issue. Another issue is, should it be voluntary? So this was beloved of Mrs. Thatcher. Yes, we're all very concerned about inequality, but do not compulsorily take money from people to address that. It should be voluntary. And there's very extensive voluntary contributions in the US. The problem with that is you may get a very, very low redistribution policy, but it is an issue. You can be in favour of inequality, but be against state intervention for reducing it. And then the last point is the geographic reference point. I saw on Richard's slide, there's 12% on unemployment, living in poverty in Switzerland. That 12% are probably on incomes 8 to 10 times the income of some countries in Africa. So the geographic reference point is a single political unit. And no matter how wealthy the country gets, you could have still the same relative poverty. So I keep reminding students, bear in mind, we're talking about the statistics we look at for Ireland, but bear in mind the global situation and some of the things you're seeing on television over the last few weeks. The other thing we looked at, and Richard has provided an absolutely fine example of providing evidence. I just start with this image since it was, sorry, that's not fitting on the screen, but it's somebody begging on a bridge, and you might say, well, look at that, that's enough evidence. And of course, the person dying in the street in Dublin recently led to far more policy change than any amount of statistics that we can provide. So that's the emotional argument. People say, well, it's self-evident. What do you mean? But there are other measures we use. As we know there's the Lorenz curves, which give us the Gini coefficients. And I just want to mention two others. There's regional or life cycle issues as well, which I've mentioned. So we are concerned about regional inequalities across Ireland, and we are also concerned, or should address, life cycle inequality. But as I said, that may be, as I said already, students at the low end of the income scale and to rise later. And then there's this issue of not looking at distribution, but avoiding poverty and providing basic necessities, and a lot of evidence provided on that. So let me just move on. The key policy issues that I was just thinking about. One is whether benefits should be targeted or universal. So the child benefit is the big issue in Ireland over the last few years. So that's an interesting issue. The other is the free GP care for all children under 6. So it's an issue that should be addressed. Should it be targeted? And the more targeted it is, of course, the higher the level of benefit you can give. The other issue that's beloved of economists is, should you give transfers in kind or cash transfers? So free education is a transfer in kind, but why not give the people the money directly and let them decide? So the example I often give is, if somebody comes to your door, would you give them money or would you prefer to give them material goods? And most people would prefer not to give them money. But that's very paternalistic, but it is an issue. Why do we have transfers in kind, and when do we have cash transfers? Intergenerational equity is becoming a huge issue, especially given the borrowing in last year. So it's not between people in Irish society at present. It's the burden that's been passed on to future generations because of the activity of my generation and generation below me. And that also steers me in relation to the environment. The environmental costs that are going to come 50, 60 years down the line. I might say, well, I won't be here, so why care? But that, again, is an intergenerational issue which has some significance. The other 2 points I meant is there's always this issue. It's a genuine hardship, but you have to weigh that up against disincentives. So that economists are always concerned about that issue. And no matter what way we look at it, though, inequality is at the core, I say many here, but maybe all, economic policy issues. So the property tax, the universal social charge, the bank crisis, child benefit, they all have a huge distributional dimension as well as economics, so you can't separate the two. I started out by saying there's been a long line of distinguished people contributing, economists contributing to the debate on inequalities. Let me end with the most recent one, which is Mr. Piketty, who won the financial year. This got enormous publicity, and it's a work almost totally concerned with distributional issues. And it's interesting here, just throw that into the end, how he pronounces his own name. So thank you very much, and congratulations again, Richard.
Thank you very much, John. Having heard from an economist, we will now hear from a political scientist. Anne Wren is currently adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science here in Trinity, and formerly a staff member in the Department of Politics in Stanford University. Her most recent book is an edited collection published by Oxford University Press entitled The Political Economy of the Service Transition. Very welcome, Anne.
Thanks, Richard. Just show me which button to press so I can get through the slides quickly. Left and right. There you go, okay. Well, first off, I'd just like to say thanks so much to Richard. It was such a substantive talk that I think I'm going to be thinking about it for a long time. And I also wanted to say thanks very much for coming up with the idea of having an interdisciplinary discussion on this topic. It's something close to my heart. And I really believe that this is something that we need to be talking about in an interdisciplinary environment. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk briefly today. Just responding to Richard's talk, I mean, I guess there are three areas where I'd like to try and comment as quickly as I can. I mean, first, his central question, is there a choice between equality and other desirable economic outcomes? Secondly, I think for me, the question is, if those choices exist, what can the study of political science tell us about the way that these kinds of choices get made? So that's the really key question. The last question that Richard tries to get to at the end of the talk, and of course what should concern us all, is if the choices exist, then what is to be done? Maybe I won't get to that, so I won't have to answer the question. So first, is there a trade-off between equality and growth? I mean, I don't want to spend too long on this, and I have worked on this, as Richard alluded to, but I would like to just confront people, I think, with a little bit of data. And what this is showing is variation in a range of distributional outcomes across a set of countries that are very similar levels of economic development. So all wealthy countries at similar levels of GDP per capita. And I would say all faced with one common big challenge, which is the challenge of deindustrialization, right? So in all of these countries, we now have less than 15% of the population actually working in manufacturing or agricultural jobs. So the big task, right, is how do we get people into services employment? And you can see there, well, the US is doing quite well. 73% of its working age population are employed. But of course, as we all know, this comes at a cost of really high rates of inequality, right? That says D5, D1 ratio. Actually, it should say D9, D1. So the ratio of people at the very top of the earnings distribution to the bottom is close to 5 to 1 in the US, right? And those two things are linked, right? The reason why the US has done so well in job creation over the last few decades is because it's created a lot of employment in very low productivity service sectors at very low wages, right? Germany and Sweden, you can see, are doing much better in terms of equality, right? So the D5, D1 ratio is only half as high in these countries. But in Germany, you can see that they're really not doing so well in terms of employment creation at all, right? So 62% of the population actually in jobs compared with 73% in the US. And of course, that's partially possible because women are still not participating in the labor force to the same extent. Now, that's changed in recent years, and parts of this have changed in recent years. But Sweden, as usual, you know, we seem to have the holy grail, right? So we have high rates of equality, lots of people working, lots of women working. Well, part of the reason why we can do that is because we employ a lot of people in public services, and over 20% of the population in government employment. So we spend a lot and we pay for it via taxes. Okay, so I mean, the point that I really want to make here is just to echo what Richard's saying, right? We don't see any progression towards certain patterns of equality over time as growth occurs, right? We see very developed countries, all quite wealthy, but with really different patterns of equality. So in some countries, people are excluded from work. In others, they have very different types of wage rates. And in other countries, we might avoid these things, but we pay for it. We pay a lot of tax, okay? We won't talk about Ireland, probably best not to, but it's a joke, I don't have time. But so the big question emerging, when I see variation in distributional outcomes like this, which is clearly so significant, the big question is, what can politics tell us about how these choices got made? Because to echo Richard, right, these are choices. There were policy decisions at the basis of this. There are institutions at the basis of this. So it's a political question, right? So some very brief things on this. One thing is the D5, D1 ratio, which is really important, or this is actually the D1, D5, it's flipped. Really important to the capacity to generate private service sector jobs at low wages if you wanted to do so, and it's a choice. Very closely linked to the centralization of wage bargaining, right? So where wage bargaining is really centralized, wage structures get compressed, okay? And these are institutions that have been in place for a long time, right? Compromises were made over these wage bargaining institutions in many countries quite a long time ago. And while a lot of decentralization has taken place, the really striking thing, if you look at this chart, which looks at the evolution of centralization over time, is that really the most interesting variation is not the change over time. It's the big variation across countries. All of which is to say that political decisions that were taken about the centralization of bargaining at certain points of time continue to have an impact into the future. You know, the institutions, once they're in place, can be sticky. The political costs of adjusting institutions are very high. For example, in Germany, you know, we have big producer interests on the employer and union side that have devised strategies around having very coordinated wage bargaining. So it's hard to convince those actors that we should change these things. When it comes to public sector employment and the willingness to have a large public sector, I mean, clearly it's probably no surprise, it's closely linked to the historical strength of left parties. You can see a tight correlation in this graph, and you can see, of course, Sweden and Norway and Denmark up in the top right-hand corner there. Again, this is something that goes back quite a long time in history, right? It goes right back to the red-green coalitions. It goes back to agreements between those political parties in how to respond to the decline of the agricultural sector, right? The creation of public service employment opportunities for women in rural areas in response to that set of challenges, sets these countries in a trajectory of large public service employment and large female participation. But the point really is that, so historical decisions matter and historical institution building matters, but over time that alters politics, right? So once institutions and policies are in place, coalitions form and people form their preferences around the policies that are in place, and that can be hard to change. Again, I want to be quick, so I might not really talk about this, but since it says the political significance of public sector employees, which probably a lot of people in this room are interested in, maybe I will. This is just to emphasize I won't be able to explain these properly, but really what the graph on the left shows you is how willing you are to support more welfare state spending. And the question these people were asked is, will you support it even if you have to pay more taxes? The groups around the bottom are low-skilled workers in sheltered and exposed economic sectors, highly skilled workers in sheltered and exposed economic sectors. So that highly skilled sheltered group are, for the most part, public sector workers. And the really interesting thing here is that you can see that their preferences are aligned with the low-skilled groups, right? And it's the highly skilled, exposed workers that are far less supportive, far less willing to support spending, far less willing to support high taxation. So if you think back to those social democratic regimes, right, we have this big group of people that are employed in public service sectors and are willing to ally with less skilled groups in support, in defense of those continued policies. On redistribution more generally, you can see that the highly skilled, exposed group, sheltered group is kind of in the middle. So they're, but again, forming a sort of bridge and increasing the capacity for coalition formation. So very quickly, because I've got about 1 minute left, on the what is to be done question, right? Avoiding the trade-off between equality and employment creation in services-based economies. Lots of graphs here that I won't talk about, but essentially, I've argued elsewhere, right, that expansion in high productivity service sectors is what allows us to get away from these trade-offs to an extent. So we can have an expansion in low productivity sectors without having to rely on low wages in those sectors to generate employment. And it can also facilitate the financing of public services. I've also argued that what we need for this is the development of a high-quality college-educated labour force. What does this require? It requires public investment in tertiary education, but also, to echo Richard, it very importantly it requires public investment in early childhood education, especially if it's going to be an equitable strategy and not one which causes more inequality. The politics of this, how do we form a coalition around this sort of strategy for reform? And this is probably, I think, when we look at Richard's question about what needs to be done, this is the sort of the political question underlying this, right? Obstacles, the obstacles to obtaining support for investment in tertiary education comes from obtaining the support of low-skilled groups in an environment where access isn't equal, and quite rightly so, right? Also, there's an obstacle in terms of obtaining the support for highly skilled and exposed workers for basically any kind of strategy of public spending. And that goes back to the graph that I was looking at before. But bridges, and here I think the support of low-skilled group for early childhood education policy is important. But also I'd emphasize above all that one of the main findings in political science on these kinds of topics now is that there is a big gender gap in these issues. So that women at all income levels are much more likely to support any kind of policy of public service provision and redistribution. So just to close, I'd say that on the political science side, in order to understand whether the political capacity exists to avoid these undesirable trade-offs, the job really at the moment is to understand the capacity for political coalition formation around educational policy in particular, and I'd say early childhood education in particular too, although listening to Richard's talk, we might need to think a lot about health policy as well, right? So.
Thank you very much, Anne. Our final contributor or respondent this evening is Professor Paul O'Grady. Paul is currently the head of the Department of Philosophy here in Trinity and commenced his career here in Trinity in 1997, having lectured previously in St. Catherine's College in Oxford. His most recent book is Aquinas' Philosophy of Religion. So, Paul, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Richard, for an excellent lecture and an excellent idea to have this interdisciplinary gathering. When the School of Social Sciences and Philosophy was set up here about 10 years ago, somebody asked one of my colleagues, a philosopher, he said, "What's the difference between social scientists and philosophers?" My colleague thought for a minute and said, "Oh, they count and we don't." That was the joke. And there's a certain amount of hyperbole in that, insofar as there are theoreticians and the social scientists, and there are some good number crunchers in philosophy, so we produce Cartesian geometry and calculus and probability theory and so forth. But there's an element of truth in there as well, in that when you have hard evidence like Richard produced tonight, it impacts on policy and you can use it, and it's not just talking or arguing in an abstract way. So there's something really important about getting data and using it. Owen said before I came here to Trinity, I worked in Oxford and I taught in the PPE program. So the PPE program in Oxford is the progenitor, if you like, of the PPS program here. And in the Oxford system, there are typically 2 tutors dealing with a particular subject in the college. So I taught logic, theory of knowledge, etc. My colleague taught ethics and politics, and we worked away together in the college. We did our research, we wrote our books, the books went out, they were received variously in different ways. One of the differences was his book hit the front page of The Guardian, mine didn't. The reason why his hit the front page of The Guardian was the book was entitled Against Equality of Opportunity. And after his academic career, he worked as a Labour Party consultant. So he was Blunkett's consultant when this came out. So that's why it hit the front page of The Guardian. And you might wonder what kind of a guy was he, because he sounds like he might be some kind of sclerotic home county Tory who just is railing against immigrants and women. And he wasn't. So he was worried about the very notion of equality, that there's so much packed into the idea that is a very, very tricky thing. And many people who hold widely different political views sign up to the equality of opportunity ideal. One of his teachers was the Canadian philosopher Jerry Cohen. And Jerry Cohen wrote a great book called If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? And within the book, Cohen just discusses the different views, the right, the liberal left, the socialist alternatives, about society, about redistribution of wealth, about what we think about equality within the society. And one of the questions is, why do we get so worried about equality? Because if everybody's in an equally bad state, who's going to be happy? We have equality, but nobody's going to go with that. So clearly you want to distinguish different kinds of equality, so you distinguish equality of opportunity from equality of attainment or equality of outcome. And so when you start thinking about equality of opportunity, then you start saying, well, how much equality of opportunity, or what exactly do we mean in that? So there might be a minimal level at which you say, well, we don't discriminate on the basis of gender or on the basis of race, so pretty much everybody will sign up to that. But then when you begin to make it bigger, so you go to the other end of the spectrum and say, well, we want fairly radical redistribution of wealth. We want equality across the board. Well, that's going to have income implications, resource implications. So people will row back to this kind of middle space. And the problem with the middle space is that in some ways it's unstable. So it either tends to the radical or it tends to the minimal. So how do you exactly begin to eke out a space about what's an acceptable level of equality that you want within a society? And we can think about, that there are the inequalities engendered by social distribution, but they're natural inequalities. Some people are cleverer than others, some people are sicker than others. And what do we think about those inequalities and how do we engage with them? Part of the deal is it depends on the sets of values you have in the background. So one of the motivators behind equality of opportunity is the thought that, well, the best person might get the best person gets the job. But on that view, equality is subservient to an ideal of efficiency. The reason why the best person gets the job is because you want the economy, or the society, to work in an efficient fashion. A different model is to base equality on a notion of fairness, or the idea that there are individual rights. And those aren't exactly compatible viewpoints. You're going to get people disagreeing about how that goes. It also seems that if you're interested in this area, you're going to think about happiness, you're going to think about well-being and how they're related to issues about equality. And clearly, in many of the studies that are done, happiness is correlated with wealth at a certain threshold level. But also clearly beyond a certain threshold, happiness isn't correlated with wealth. So you pour more money into a system, but not necessarily people get happier by virtue of doing that. And just think of, in terms of stereotypical examples of the happiness level of the progeny of the Celtic Tiger era, the Celtic Tiger cubs, with rootlessness or anomie or whatever you want to describe going on there, versus, say, people coming from a less wealthy circumstance where there's very strong community, where there's strong social infrastructure in place there. So wealth is subservient to producing other structures, and the structures are going to be shaped by the values that are there in the background. As John mentioned also, there are going to be relativities. So what counts as being poor here is going to be different to what counts as being poor in Africa. But even within the society itself, you know, what's the relevant measure? And one of the interesting questions, are there any absolute standards, or is it all relativistic? So is there a certain threshold, or are there certain structures that we think everybody should have, or is it all divvied up according to different relativities and different scales? So in some ways, the point that I want to make here is that that debate about values and that debate about the vision of society that you want to have is not going to be determined by the empirical data. So the data will be very, very useful, and I think Richard's discussion about the upstream versus the downstream is a very, very useful thing to think about, because it gives you clearly documented facts as to if you do this, then this will impact there. But the background discussion is, well, how do we want to distribute our wealth? What kind of values do we think are incarnated in that distribution? What's the will that we have, and what's the picture of the individual and the society that subserves these choices that we're going to make? And these values are not subjective. That is, they're not just something that happen to be the case or not. We argue about them, we analyze them, we clarify them, we try to see what are the arguments that defend these arguments, what are the benefits, what are the costs of doing things in this particular way. And that activity about arguing about these values isn't counting, but it really counts. And that's what philosophy does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That brings the formal part of the evening to a conclusion. Can I, just on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty and all of Richard's colleagues within the faculty, congratulate him on his superb inaugural lecture, thank our three respondents for their very insightful response to Richard's paper, and can I suggest that those who are interested in continuing this conversation, that we do so in the more convivial atmosphere of the Senior Common Room over a glass of wine. You're all very welcome. Thank you very much.